Hello friends, my name is JJ. So when I was a kid, it took me a while before I learned that Canada and the US were supposed to be considered these two very different places. When you're little, I think you really barely understand the concept of countries beyond the idea that places really far away are really different. And America wasn't very far away. My family drove there all the time and everything seemed pretty much the same. When I would read American books or watch American TV shows as a kid, I never thought of them as taking place in some exotic foreign land, since all of the themes and settings seemed basically identical to the sort of stuff I saw in my own daily life. I remember being much more weirded out by stuff that came from Britain, where the characters would always be eating marmalade and talking about Father Christmas and stuff. That seemed foreign. I can actually vividly remember the very first time I was confronted with the existence of Canadian stereotypes. It was an episode of Bobby's World, which was this dreadful cartoon from the 1990s based around the comedy work of future game show host Howie Mandel. In the episode, Bobby and his family go to Canada for a holiday, which is depicted as this kind of weird wilderness place where it always rains and people have these obnoxiously strong accents.
Yeah, so is this your little hoser nephew, eh?
Are you real Canadians?
Yeah. The genuine article, eh?
The irony is that Howie Mandel himself was born in Canada. And I remember thinking that this depiction of Canada was kind of weird and didn't really track with my own understanding of what Canada was. I remember talking to my father about it, and he was like, well, son, that is just a stereotypical depiction of Canada. And a stereotype is when people try to be funny or mean by saying that one type of people are all one way. For example, can you think of a time where you've heard Canadians stereotype Americans for all being one way? And of course I could, because spreading unfair stereotypes about the United States is like the essence of Canadian nationalism. And from that point on, I knew it would be my life's mission to help battle stereotypes on both sides of the 49th parallel. Canada and the United States are the two most closest similar countries in the world, so the least we can do is have an accurate understanding of each other. Last year, the Simpsons, which is my favorite show in the entire world, did an episode where the family visited Canada. In the 30 years the show has been on the air, they've actually visited Canada many times, probably more than any other country that's been depicted on the show, but it still makes big news in Canada every time. And so, in the spirit of cross-border understanding, I thought I would make a little reaction video to this episode for your benefit, in which I deconstruct some of the ways that Canada is presented and let you know from my perspective as someone who spends a lot of time thinking and talking about Canadian issues, how accurate or not some of these stereotypical depictions of my country are. What's interesting is how Canadian stereotypes have evolved a lot since I was a kid. They've become a lot less goofy and a lot more sharply political, which, from what I can recall, is a big theme of this episode. An episode called, appropriately enough, Do Canada. So the setup of this episode is basically that Homer decides to take his family on another one of their trademark crappy vacations, in this case to upstate New York. And while they're there, Bart and Lisa are clowning around at Niagara Falls, which results in Lisa accidentally falling across the border and winding up in Ontario. And here is where the episode officially kicks off.
Oh, sweetie, thank God, thank God.
Your daughter's fine, but I recommend a 5-day stay.
Of course. We'll take out a third mortgage.
Sir, you're in Canada now, where your healthcare is free!
So this is, of course, one of the great cliches that you always see in American depictions of Canada, an emphasis on the free healthcare and all of that. And regardless of, whether or not we want to get into the conversation of, well, what is free healthcare? Canadians pay for it in other ways. But one thing that I think is important to remember is that in real life, Lisa and her family, they're Americans. They're not Canadian citizens, and the Canadian healthcare system does not exist to just provide free healthcare to any random foreigner who shows up. If you're a foreigner in Canada and you break your leg or whatever and have to use the emergency room, you would have to pay. I actually took a photo of the prices in the emergency room in the hospital near where I live, just because I want people to understand this. This is why these kind of depictions can actually be quite pernicious. If you are an American or any other foreigner who is visiting Canada, you have to get traveler's health insurance. Otherwise, you could wind up with a big medical bill if you get sick or injured while you're in this country. This idea that because the Canadian healthcare system is, quote unquote, free for Canadian residents, that somehow means that this is just this kind of like big open, medical system that any random foreigner can just waltz into and get any sort of treatment they want paid for. That is a completely inaccurate depiction. And I think that sort of presentations like this are are actually a kind of disinformation that can actually be dangerous to Americans planning on making trips to Canada if they think this is how the Canadian healthcare system works.
I'm not delirious. In fact, I've never felt more protected. Not like back home.
Oh, hang on. Did you just say you don't feel safe in your home country? Lisa, as you're clearly a victim of political persecution who fears for her life, I must keep you in Canada, where you'll be safe and assigned your own hockey team.
Please not Ottawa. Please not Ottawa.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
So, I mean, independently of Ottawa being a terrible hockey team, which is a very funny joke, sort of the larger depiction of Canadian asylum, I mean, this is obviously completely inaccurate. If you're a foreigner who wants to seek asylum or refugee status in Canada, obviously you have to instigate that process yourself. The Canadian government does not conclude when they have decided that the country you come from is oppressive enough to keep you stuck in Canada indefinitely. I mean, even if you're not protected by the Canadian Medicare system when you're in Canada, you are protected by the Canadian Constitution, and the Canadian Constitution grants a constitutional right to leave Canada if you so choose. So there is no way that the government could force Lisa to stay in Canada if she didn't want to. It is also worth noting that Canada does not officially recognize refugee claims from the United States. I mean, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. It might be most accurate to say that Canada does not encourage refugee claims from the United States. This was an issue of some significance a few years ago where there was a sort of inflow of asylum seekers from the US trying to cross the border into Canada. These were immigrants to America who theoretically claimed that they sort of feared the vindictiveness of the Trump administration and so forth. But these people could only get into Canada and make those claims if they crossed the border illegally. Because if you tried to cross the border legally at like a formal point of entry border crossing, the guards would turn you away because they would say, no, we don't recognize refugee claims from the United States. But of course, once you get into Canada, you have constitutional rights and there's a process that unfolds. So maybe there is something to this, but yeah, in the real world, you would be instigating that process. The government wouldn't decide for you.
Look, I'm fine, eh?
We're losing her.
Mom, I'm okay. They put me in a nice foster home with Gordon Francette here.
I like the way that the very typical Canadian couple is depicted. You know, the man wearing the flannel shirt and this kind of very sort of square, kind of unfashionable woman. What did they say the names were? Those were like good kind of stereotypical white Canadian names.
Home with Gordon Francette here.
Lisa, where should we go for dinner tonight? Harvey's or Swiss Chalet?
How about Mr. Submarine? Or Earl's?
Don't forget Humpty's.
Restaurant chains I never heard of.
So yeah, those are all restaurant chains in Canada. They're all sort of kind of middle class sort of places. I actually, I'm fond of such places. Swiss Chalet is a family restaurant sort of based around rotisserie chicken. Harvey's is like a fast food burger place. They don't actually have that many of them out here. Mr. Sub is just a knockoff of Subway. I feel like it's kind of on the decline these days because it is also objectively worse than Subway. And then Humpty's is a kind of middle-class family restaurant, sort of like Denny's. I associate it very much with Alberta. And then Earl's is this kind of restaurant where middle-class people go to feel like they're having a fancy night out. I don't really know if there's an American chain that is similar to it, but I'm sure there must be. It's one of these places where like the lights are kind of dim and all of the waitresses are very pretty and only wear black. And they give all of the food like really fancy names, even though it's still basically just like burgers and things. Women like to go there for their girls' nights and order lots of margaritas.
Can you fall in love with a country?
Alanis Morissette Elementary School. We all know who Alanis Morissette is, right? Famous Canadian-born songstress. There's some fun little things here in the classroom I can see as well. You can see they have the food pyramid of poutine with gravy, french fries, and cheese curds. Poutine is, of course, very iconic, sort of stereotypical Canadian food. And then over here, this is interesting. So they have these two portraits on the wall, and the bottom one is of Gordie Howe, as he was depicted in an earlier Simpsons episode. Gordie Howe was a hockey player back in the day, and Bart cut his picture out of a magazine and then mailed it to Mrs. Krabappel when he was like writing fake love letters to her, and that was who he pretended he was. And then on the top here, that's supposed to be John A. Macdonald, who was the first Prime Minister of Canada.
The science textbooks acknowledge climate change.
So the book is called Science by Scientists. This is really sort of more of an American joke. You can see that the textbook says not available in Texas. This is a reference to the fact that Texas is one of the major sort of textbook buying states in the US because its population is so large. And so as a result, the argument has long been that textbook manufacturers kind of have to appease sort of Texan sensibilities and the sensibilities of the Texan government, which is of course very conservative. And so as a result, you know, things like climate change and evolution and, you know, communism and whatever are sort of massaged in their presentation in a way that is sort of acceptable to kind of, you know, the Republican ethos.
Class, let's give an enthusiastic but quiet hello to Lisa Simpson.
Hello. As an American, I'd like to apologize for something our president said about your wonderfully progressive prime minister. Is there any way I can send a note, or maybe I could...
Right this way.
Oh.
I don't really know what this is getting at, like this idea that somehow in Canada it's very easy to get in touch with the prime minister. I mean, I guess compared to America it is, just because Canada is much smaller, but it's kind of an odd thing.
I am really, really sorry about what our president called you.
I don't think about it. I've moved on. Weak. He called me weak.
Absolutely.
To start with, the depiction of the Prime Minister's office is very accurate. That's very much what it looks like. But this joke here is kind of based on a bit of a false premise. You know, it is true that Donald Trump often made fun of foreign leaders and said very insulting things about them on Twitter. But that wasn't really the case with Justin Trudeau. Trudeau and Trump actually seem to have a mostly amicable relationship in comparison to some other relationships he had with world leaders. This tweet that they're referencing is, I think, actually one of the only times that Trump said something explicitly mean to Trudeau, certainly at the time that this episode would have been made. The other thing I know is that I believe that they wanted to get the actual Trudeau to do the voice here. Currently serving world leaders have made cameos in The Simpsons before. I know Tony Blair appeared in the Britain episode.
Hello, welcome to the United Kingdom.
Prime Minister Tony Blair?
But when they couldn't get the real Trudeau for whatever reason, they went with a Trudeau impersonator instead, who was actually very talented. He has some very funny videos on YouTube.
Let me ask you, does this look weak?
Seriously? Wow, that is impressive. Watch your tie.
So this is a reference to a viral photo of Trudeau from some years ago. You know, Trudeau is known for being a fit man, and he likes to do little stunts, and apparently one of the stunts he can do is sort of elevate himself by his hands in this way. It was, the picture is somewhat controversial, of course, because, you know, Trudeau's propensity to engage in sort of clowning has sort of angered a lot of people who are always like, whenever they see pictures like this, it's like, get back to work, Trudeau.
So listen, if I could just ask you one question about the SNC Lavalin scandal?
So that's another very accurate depiction. That's what the Prime Minister's building looks like, the building where the Prime Minister works in Ottawa. And the thing that Lisa asks him about, the SNC Lavalin scandal, that was a real political scandal of some years ago. I made a whole other video about it. The reference feels a little dated now, just because I think that the scandal didn't do quite as much damage to Trudeau as it would have been expected perhaps when this was made.
Now, Lisa, we'll be doing a class play based on a great Canadian novel.
The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz by Mordecai Rickler?
Maybe next year, Oliver.
It's never Duddy.
So the joke here is that The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz is like this very adult novel written by Mordecai Rickler, who was one of Canada's great authors. Man, I actually admire quite a bit, because I think that he did some very good commentary on sort of the nature of Canadian identity and stuff. But The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz is like this story about like a Jewish Montreal man who sort of lives a life of sort of scamming and stuff in sort of the 1940s, a very particular moment in sort of Canadian society, in Montreal society, Quebec society, Jewish Canadian identity, all of this sort of thing. It's a very sort of like sophisticated adult novel that would not make for a good children's play.
No, we're doing a child-friendly version of The Handmaid's Tale.
Ooh, I'd like to try out for Offred.
This is equally preposterous, a child-friendly version of The Handmaid's Tale. I mean, I think we all know The Handmaid's Tale by now because of the big Netflix series. The original Handmaid's Tale novel was written by Margaret Atwood, who's a very famous Canadian author, probably the most famous Canadian author of all time.
I'd like to try out for Offred.
Oh, so you're asking directly for something you want. Well, that's not very Canadian, but I like it.
I actually kind of like that joke, even though that's very stereotypical. I definitely think that there is a certain kind of Canadian who is extremely passive-aggressive in that way when it comes to wanting things. I think there is a kind of sensibility that some middle class, and especially like upper middle class Canadians are taught, where you should always sort of imply you want something rather than asking for it, which can be quite maddening in its own way because it really puts a lot of onus on the other person to kind of like read your mind and detect your sort of subtle indications of interest.
I have to get my daughter back. Can I hide in the trunk?
Okay, but don't tell anyone we're going up for beer.
We all know.
Oh.
So this is a real border crossing, the Ambassador Bridge, which connects Detroit to Windsor, Ontario. I believe it's the single busiest border crossing in the entire US-Canada border. So if I have this right, the drinking age in every Canadian province is lower than the drinking age in every American state. This is often imagined to be a national policy in both countries, but it's actually a local policy in both places. The fact that every American state has a drinking age of 21 has something to do with highway legislation that was implemented by Elizabeth Dole when she was Secretary of Transportation, if I recall correctly. But there is some variation of drinking age between the Canadian provinces, although only by like a year or two.
What's this blue stuff, eh? Oh, it's called a cartail. Stupid new American fad. Oh, we'll get it in 6 months. Move along.
If anything, I would say that that is a little generous to Canada.
Goodbye.
So this is what I would think of as being like a very traditional kind of old-fashioned house that you sometimes see in Eastern Canada. I don't really know a lot about architecture, so somebody else can tell me like what this style is, but I really remember seeing houses like this when I was in Toronto or Montreal. And in this little sign here, it says, "Give us your Alec Baldwins, your Lena Dunhams, yearning to breathe free." And this is a reference to the idea that, you know, every time a Republican gets elected, there's always a bunch of liberal celebrities like Alec Baldwin and Lena Dunham who are like, we're gonna move to Canada. Has any celebrity ever moved to Canada is a good question. Most celebrities move out of Canada in reality.
Oh, sweetie. This is the best hug we've ever had.
Yes, it's wonderful. Please don't make me leave.
Your home is with us, not them.
This is interesting. This is a very sort of subtle joke here. The carpet here is done up in the style of the logo of the Quebec City Nordiques, which is a sort of dead hockey team. Oh, and I just noticed this now, and the lamp in the background is the Stanley Cup. Oh, and here's another little subtle thing. I'm very eagle-eyed here. You can see they have a framed picture of the CN Tower in the background. The iconic Toronto landmark.
I'm really gonna miss this place.
If it makes you feel any better, Canada exploits its environment too.
What?
This country does it all. Tar sands, strip mining, mountie mocking, geese goosing, French fry gravying.
So, you know, much of this episode is obviously based on the premise that sort of Canada is this very liberal country in contrast to the United States, and that somebody like Lisa would sort of idolize Canada and want to live there, yada yada, which is, you know, a trope that is common on the US left. But there has been some growing pushback to that, in part led by left-wing Canadians themselves. And one of the sort of self-criticisms that left-wing Canadians often bring up when they're trying to sort of say, you know, Canada's not all that great, is this kind of stuff about the environment. Canada has an economy, both historically and in the present day, that has been, you know, heavily based around the exploitation of natural resources. The carbon footprint produced by the Canadian oil and mining sector in particular is extremely high. I believe that Canada has one of the highest rates of CO2 emissions per capita of any country in the world. And if you heard, she also said geese goosing.
Mountie mocking, geese goosing.
Which may or may not be a reference to the Canadian goose jacket industry. The often cruel way that geese are defeathered in order to make winter coats is another thing that's become increasingly controversial in this country.
Okay, but I'm sure you treat all peoples equally.
Except the Quebecois.
And the Newfies.
Stupid Newfies.
Okay, so I get what they're trying to say here, but I don't know if this is the angle I would have necessarily taken in making this particular argument. Like, I think that most people would agree that yes, Canada does have problems with discrimination and bigotry and inequality and this sort of thing. But I don't know if the best examples to cite of who is sort of on the receiving end of that would be the Quebecers and the Newfoundlanders. I think if most people were asked to identify, like, who are the truly disadvantaged, discriminated against groups in modern Canada, people would say, like, you know, people of color, Indigenous Canadians, and so on. But that said, you know, this does get at something a little bit more meta. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post a while ago talking about how there still do exist groups of, you know, white people in Canada who very much sort of conceptualize themselves as being a minority equivalent to like a racial minority. There are lots of French Canadians who conceptualize themselves this way and will speak of like anti-French attitudes as being racist, for instance. And the Newfoundlanders also have a sort of curious understanding of what exactly they are, which leads into this controversial next segment.
Quebecois and the Newfies.
Stupid Newfies.
I'm a newfie! Whee! I guess that does make me feel a little better.
So this sequence was controversial in Newfoundland itself for a number of reasons. The main one is just, of course, that Newfoundlanders do not like being portrayed as dummies, which is why the decision to make Ralph Wiggum their representative was a little intentionally provocative. The other thing was using the term Newfie. In recent years, the Newfoundlanders have really tried to make this term understood as a slur, like a deeply offensive, bigoted statement. I've seen some people dragooned into apologizing after using it publicly. This gets into the idea that some Newfoundlanders really sort of think of themselves as like a minority, and thus entitled to the sort of social protections that racial and religious minorities get. It always strikes me as a little overwrought. Like Newfie you could sort of say as a term like hick or redneck or something. Like in my opinion, I don't know if I would say that this really rises to the level of something that should be that offensive. And then there's this part where he beats up the seal, which is an allusion to the Newfoundland sealing industry. There are a fair number of Newfoundlanders who are employed in what is, I think, quite widely regarded as quite a barbaric industry of clubbing seals in order to harvest their meat and fur. There is not actually a lot of market demand for seal fur and meat these days, so this is an industry that is very heavily subsidized by the government. But a lot of Newfoundlanders are very defensive about it, and to some degree this has become a sort of culture war issue in Canada. You know, it's like, are you on the side of these proud, white, blue-collar, hard-working Canadians just trying to make a living, doing the thing that they've done for 100 years? Or are you on the side of the effete, urban, progressive vegetarians who are afraid of a little animal blood?
Where the wind blows cold and there's ice and snow, some days go on forever.
I'm not actually sure what that song is. The Newfoundlanders are also sort of famous for having a lot of folk music, so I think that's what that's supposed to be an allusion to. If you actually know what that song is, let me know. It's certainly, I wouldn't say, a well-known Canadian song. Coming soon, Julian Assange. No, that first building was actually what the Canadian Supreme Court looks like. So again, a good attention to detail.
Our top story tonight, Estranged Brew.
So this is a reference to the movie Strange Brew, which starred Bob and Doug McKenzie, these characters from a comedy show that was on in the, I guess in the 1970s. This is them here, I think, Bob and Doug McKenzie.
Marge Simpson and her daughter have now been banned from the United States, just like asbestos. And this just in, asbestos is back into America's hospitals and schools.
I don't know if this was intentional or not, but that is perhaps a reference to another sort of famous Canadian sin, which is the degree that we are one of the biggest asbestos-producing nations in the world. So anyway, Marge continues to persuade Lisa to come back to America, which triggers this little sequence where she looks over at Detroit with her thing of Molson's Junior beer, a reference to Molson Canadian, very iconic Canadian beer company. And all of her American heroes, including the Jeopardy-playing robot and Louis Armstrong, emerge to remind her of what makes America great, and she realizes the error of her ways.
Get your ass back over here.
Yes, sir, Satchmo. America ain't perfect, but it's my job to make it better. See you soon.
What are you going over there for?
It's legal now.
What is past the Dutch?
I feel like this particular gag is getting increasingly out of date with each passing year, as more and more states legalize marijuana in their own right.
will get you across the river. Nous allons vous faire traverser la rivière. God, it wastes so much time saying everything twice.
I agree. Official bilingualism is bad.
Ooh, we must ditch our excess cargo. You two.
You're abandoning us in the middle of a frozen river? Wow, Canadians really can be jerks.
Yes, for every Martin Short, there is no shortage of Shatners.
I'm sure I don't need to explain that one to you. Martin Short, one of Canada's most beloved actors, versus William Shatner, one of Canada's least beloved, or at least in some ways most infamous. But then in the end, Homer comes to save the day, and a grateful Lisa returns home to Springfield.
Now can we do Duddy Kravitz? No, we're gonna watch an episode of The Beachcombers. Oh.
The Beachcombers was, I think, Canada's longest running television show. It was about like lumberjacks in British Columbia or something. I actually don't know anything about it. All right, and we are done. So I would give this episode a soft 5. It is obvious that a lot of effort has been put into researching Canadian stuff in order to ensure the episode is filled with lots of in-jokes and references that would both be amusing to audiences in this country, while also presenting Canada as a more fully rounded place than what you sometimes see in other pop culture portrayals. And I think the episode deserves credit for at least attempting to push back against the Canada is a liberal utopia stereotype that has obviously been gaining traction in America for quite some time. Clearly reached a peak during the Trump years, which is obviously what this episode is in conversation with. But, you know, at the end of the day, I just really don't feel like I find this style of gawking at the other type of humor all that amusing. To pull it off effectively, I really think you have to strike a delicate balance between getting some things right and some things spectacularly, flamboyantly wrong on purpose. And I'm not really sure if this episode does that. I thought the one where the family went to Britain was much better in this sense, but then again, maybe I'm just too close to the source material in this case. Now, I know that these sort of so-and-so reacts type videos are all the rage on YouTube these days. Lawyer reacts, doctor reacts, therapist reacts, former baby reacts, and so on. If you would like to see me give more of my unique blend of Canadian analysis to another depiction of Canada and pop culture, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you next week.